When a young girl is abducted from her Salt Lake City home in the dead of night and found in a nearby canal the next day, a decades-long search for the worst kind of predator begins. The hunt for a killer spans more than 2 decades and into the present day in this episode of Last Seen Alive. Thanks for listening to Last Seen Alive. I'm your host, Leah, crime analyst by day and true crime storyteller by night.
And I'm your co-host, Scott.
Rosa Maria Tapia, who went by Rosie, was last seen alive on August 13th, 1995. She was just 6 years old and lived with her parents and siblings in an apartment complex in the Glendale neighborhood of Salt Lake City, Utah. The Tapia family was close-knit, and Rosie was a sweet and fun-loving little girl who enjoyed things like playing Nintendo, riding her bike, and playing at her apartment complex's playground with the other neighborhood kids. She was the middle child in her family. She lived with her 2 younger twin siblings who were 4, and also had older siblings, including a sister who, at age 18, was already an adult. On the night of her death, Rosie's parents went out together to enjoy a Saturday evening date, leaving Rosie and the twins in the care of their 18-year-old sister, Amelia. By the time they got home that night, Rosie and her twin siblings were asleep in the bedroom they shared. We know because Rosie's mom, Lorraine, popped briefly into their bedroom to check on them when she arrived home at approximately 2 a.m. At the time, all was well. However, the next time Lorraine checked on her 3 youngest children, it was a very different story. Lorraine woke up just a few hours later at approximately 5 a.m. in the morning, feeling uneasy. She wasn't sure what, but she sensed that something wasn't right. Call it a mother's intuition. Maybe a strange noise heard in her sleep had alerted her that something was wrong. I don't know. But she got out of bed and went to check on Rosie and her twin siblings. At that early hour, the sun hadn't even risen yet, and the kids should all still have been asleep. But to Lorraine's alarm, she discovered that although the twins were still fast asleep, Rosie wasn't in the bedroom. Naturally, Lorraine immediately began looking for her, quickly searching every corner of the apartment. When she couldn't find Rosie anywhere, she panicked. This woke up her husband, Roberto, and her 18-year-old daughter, Amelia. Roberto and Amelia immediately joined the search, scouring the grounds outside the apartment for any sign of Rosie. Unfortunately, they found none, and so they called the police and reported Rosie missing. When officers arrived, they didn't have much information to go on, but there was one thing that clearly suggested the possibility of foul play. When Lorraine had realized that Rosie was missing from her bedroom, she'd also noticed something else. The bedroom window was wide open, which definitely wasn't how it had been at 2 a.m. when she'd last checked on the kids. In fact, not only was the bedroom window open, the screen had been removed and the blinds weren't even in the window any longer. They were laying on the floor. And this was especially alarming because their apartment was a basement-level unit. Anyone could creep along and reach the window, probably without being noticed. No ladder or special equipment necessary.
This isn't the first time we've had some mother's intuition just cause alarm or be the triggering point for something not being right.
No, actually, we discussed that in the Cleishindra Hall case. Sometimes it's hard to say how, but moms just know.
And now onto the window. So it definitely wasn't smashed or forced open in any way, shape, or form.
Well, no, because to the best of my knowledge, it hadn't been locked. So they opened the window, there was a screen in the way, they removed the screen, and then they somehow knocked down the blinds entirely onto the floor.
Okay.
But no, they didn't shatter the glass. That wasn't necessary. But the point is, it looked very much as if someone had entered the bedroom through the window. Because of this, police knew that they were looking for a missing child and that there was a possibility that she had been abducted. But it wasn't a police officer who found Rosie. It was an ordinary citizen. The following morning, just a few hours after Rosie's disappearance, a local man walking his dog along a canal just a few blocks away from Rosie's apartment complex noticed what appeared to be a large doll floating in the water. The more he looked, though, the more clear it became that he wasn't looking at a doll, he was looking at a human being. He summoned police who responded and found that the small body was Rosie's. She was deceased. Heartbreakingly, Rosie's big sister Amelia was riding in a police car being transported to the station to give a statement regarding her sister's disappearance when radio traffic abruptly informed her that a small child's body had been located in the canal. That was how she found out. She heard it over the radio, and according to the Deseret News, she knew instantly that the remains had to be Rosie's. Her little sister was gone. At first, investigators were open to all possibilities, including the possibility that Rosie may have left her family's apartment of her own free will and ended up in the water accidentally. However, Rosie's family insisted that she never would have absconded from home on her own in the dead of night. They knew Rosie, and they were, of course, absolutely right, and the autopsy proved it. Soon after Rosie's body was retrieved from the water and turned over to the medical examiner, everyone's darkest fears were confirmed. Her ending up in the canal had been no accident. Yes, she had drowned, but the physical evidence indicated that she'd been murdered. That is, someone else had deliberately caused her drowning, and they'd done so after sexually assaulting her. The autopsy revealed clear signs of blunt force trauma and of sexual assault. With the grim realization that a deadly child predator had infiltrated the community came the necessity of identifying that predator before they could harm anyone else. But the task proved to be much easier said than done. Many possibilities have been and are still being explored in relation to Rosie's murder. One of the possibilities people have speculated about in the years since Rosie's death involves her older sister, Amelia, who was babysitting that night. According to an article by Peyton Harkins for the Salt Lake Tribune, people wondered whether 18-year-old Amelia might have thrown a party that night in her parents' absence. Rumors swirled that that might have been the case and that one of the party attendees might have abducted and murdered Rosie. However, according to that same article, police never found any evidence to suggest that a party had been thrown. And what's more, as you may recall, Lawayne checked on the three youngest children, including Rosie, at approximately 2 a.m. after arriving home, and nothing had been amiss at the time. Therefore, we know that whoever abducted Rosie took her at some time between 2 and 5 a.m., which means that even if Amelia had thrown a secret party, Rosie couldn't have been abducted during the party anyway. That wasn't the only flavor of speculation that involved associates of Amelia's, though. According to an article from ABC4 News, Amelia was associated with a local gang at the time of her sister's disappearance. And there's a private investigator, with no background in law enforcement, by the way, who's promoted a theory tied to that. Here's the theory.
Before we get into the theory.
Okay.
Was he hired by anybody in particular? Like, what's his qualifications as an investigator?
I'm not going to dive into his qualifications as an investigator because, frankly, I checked them out and they're vague, but he has no background in law enforcement at all.
Okay.
And yes, he was hired by the family.
Okay.
Here's his theory, though. Quote, "We are believing that because Emmeline was part of a gang, a rival gang had it out for her and somebody targeted her. But because it was no longer Emmeline's bedroom, they snatched her sister instead." End quote. Yeah, I see your face.
Okay, so I think the gist of it is a opportunity crime where they were going and she was just the best payback.
Yes, that's what he's implying. Now, however, I don't believe this theory is very likely because kidnapping, sexually assaulting, and murdering a kindergarten-age child is not typical neighborhood gang behavior. Sure, these type of gang members may target their rivals with deadly violence, and young children are sometimes caught in the crossfire, unfortunately. But intentionally targeting a small child far too young to engage in gang life would be out of the ordinary. And when you add the child sexual assault aspect to it, well, it seems even more unlikely.
That seems like something that the fellow gang members would try to correct themselves.
Yes, most gang members say what you want about them, but they would find the abduction, sexual assault, and murder of a 6-year-old girl extremely reprehensible. So when it comes to organized criminals murdering their enemies' family members, including small children, that's a brand of cruelty that might be perpetrated by certain large organized crime entities like cartels, but not by a typical American neighborhood street gang. When it comes to the gang Amelia is said to have been associated with, it was 21st Street, which was a Hispanic Salt Lake City gang that fell under the umbrella of Norteño Association. As someone unfamiliar with Salt Lake City, I can't tell you all about 21st Street like I could say any of the gangs local to me, but I do a great deal of work related to gang violence, gang crimes. And I can tell you that being part of a neighborhood gang isn't typically associated with being a pedophilic rapist and murderer. That's just not what these gangs exist to do.
Also, you said something interesting bringing up cartels.
Uh-huh.
I would think targeting a small child within the family, that would be something that would be a targeted attack, not necessarily a random act or
it would.
opportunity attack, which is what the investigator was implying.
Yeah, and I'm not alleging that there's any sort of cartel involvement in this. I don't believe there was. I was just trying to give an example of, yes, sometimes these sort of acts can be associated with certain kinds of organized crime, but there's a huge difference between cartels and a local gang like 21st Street.
And it also doesn't fit up with the rest of the theory that we are discussing.
Right. Now, to the best of my knowledge, although the 21st Street gang was quite active back in 1995, they weren't known for sexually assaulting and murdering young children. Rather, they were known for their proclivity for graffiti. There's a reason why the crime committed against Rosie was so shocking to her community, and that's because it was unusual. Salt Lake City is home to a pretty diverse variety of gangs, and if it were common for them to perpetrate sex crimes and murder against kindergarten-age children, the city would be a nightmare, and believe me, we'd all have heard about it on the news. These types of crimes are mercifully rare, too rare to be the typical MO of street gangs, which are abundant in most American cities. Of course, that's not to say that Rosie's killer couldn't possibly have had any gang affiliations. Someone could potentially be both a gang member and, coincidentally, a pedophilic killer. But that doesn't mean that their hypothetical motivation for committing a violent sex crime against a small child would have anything to do with their gang's goals or usual activities. In this hypothetical scenario, their tendencies toward pedophilic violence would be a separate facet of their criminal identity, one that their fellow gang members might not even have known existed.
Just because of the difference in age between her and her siblings, it was definitely a targeted attack because it's such a big jump to sexual assault of a kindergartner.
Yeah, even if you could somehow stomach killing such a small child to sexually assault them, that is not something that the average criminal has anywhere in their wheelhouse.
It does not fit with what I know about mistaken identity crimes.
Yeah, you're totally correct. It takes a certain kind of criminal to do that. Now back to Amelia, Rosie's big sister. Unfortunately, she died of an illness in 2020, approximately 25 years after her little sister's murder. Many have wondered whether she might have known more about what happened than she let on, primarily because of that gang affiliation, which, again, I don't believe is particularly relevant. According to a Salt Lake Tribune article, though, her mother has stated that she believes that if Amelia had harbored any secrets regarding the death of her little sister, she likely would have shared such secrets prior to her death. In fact, she actually asked Amelia before she passed whether she knew anything about Rosie's death that she hadn't disclosed, and Amelia denied knowing any such thing.
It sounds like it was known that she was going to pass and there was time.
Yes, she was ill. It was natural causes. It wasn't an accident or anything sudden like that. So if Rosie's death didn't stem from a secret party or some gang-related revenge scheme, who might have been responsible for her abduction and death? I think the answer is pretty obvious. A pedophilic sexual predator who perpetrated horrific crimes against a young child, not as part of some criminal revenge scheme, but to fulfill their own personal, disgusting criminal desires. And when it comes to who that predator might be, well, there are some clues. For starters, Rosie's little brother Robert, one of the twins who was just 4 at the time of her abduction, told investigators that he'd actually seen a strange man when they'd entered their shared bedroom on the night of Rosie's death. According to the little boy, he'd awoken to see a bearded man in the bedroom, and that man had told him to go back to sleep. If 4-year-old Robert's memory was accurate, presumably the bearded man had been Rosie's abductor. And Robert wasn't the only witness who'd seen something strange around the time of Rosie's death. There was someone else, a neighbor, who'd seen something odd. According to what the neighbor eventually told police, he'd been up very early on the morning that Rosie's body was discovered, and he'd seen a teenaged male walking away from the direction of the canal. Now, this might not sound particularly suspicious in and of itself, but there was something odd about the guy, something that stuck in his memory. According to an article by Mackenzie Stauffer for KUTV, at first, the neighbor thought that the teenager was wearing pants that were two different colors, but he eventually realized that wasn't the case. The pants he wore were jeans, and they were one solid color, but they were wet, which made the lower portions of their legs appear darker than the upper portions. The neighbor described the male with the wet pants as appearing to be Hispanic and around 16 or 17 years of age, with a slight build, high cheekbones, and short, dark hair. A few years ago, a police sketch artist worked with the neighbor to create a sketch of the potential suspect, and we've posted that on our website for anyone who'd like to check it out. So far, to the best of public knowledge, the person in that sketch has yet to be identified.
So that would put him around 40 now?
If he was a teenager at the time, yeah, that would be about right, getting into middle age. Now, theories involving unidentified males acting strangely around the time of Rosie's death don't end here, though. In fact, there's someone else who can't possibly be left out of any discussion of Rosie's death. Because his true identity has yet to be pinned down, he's often referred to simply as the Good Samaritan. Whether his intentions toward Rosie really were benign or fueled by some twisted ulterior motive remains a mystery to this day. More on that next. And now, back to Rosie's story. On the evening prior to Rosie's death, Rosie and her big sister Amelia had had a strange encounter with a man who's now sometimes referred to as the Good Samaritan. It started on the playground in the apartment complex, the one Rosie liked to play on with the other neighborhood kids. On that day, while babysitting Rosie and the twins, Amelia had walked Rosie over to that playground. Rosie wanted to play, and Amelia agreed to let her do so for a little while before bedtime. After Amelia walked Rosie over to the playground, she left her there to play, planning to return a little while later and walk her back to the apartment. However, Amelia never had the chance to walk back and collect her little sister because someone else did that for her. That someone was a man who Amelia didn't know. He approached the Tapia family's apartment carrying Rosie in his arms. According to an article by Michaela Robinson for the Deseret News, Amelia met the man at the door and he explained to her that Rosie had been on the slide at the playground when another child had kicked her, hurting her back. Apparently, he was worried that Rosie was injured, and so he'd brought her home.
So injured that she couldn't walk from a kick from a small child?
Apparently. Amelia took Rosie from the man and told him that she'd check her over for any injuries. And with that, she shut the door, but not before the man said, "Bye, Rosie." If you think this sounds suspicious now, and I know you do, based solely off of your facial expression, Scott, just wait until you hear this next part.
It would make sense to carry a small child home if they were actively crying.
Yes, but Rosie was not.
Okay, moving on.
Yeah, Amelia asked Rosie how the strange man knew her name, presumably because it was 1995, the height of the whole stranger danger public awareness campaign.
Oh, I was there for it.
Oh yeah, so was I. So I can see why Amelia might have thought this was suspicious. Well, Rosie said she didn't know how he knew her name, and she also said that she was fine and she hadn't been hurt on the playground at all. Obviously, Walking Red Flag would probably be a better moniker for this man than the Good Samaritan. And on that note, in the same Deseret News article, the same private investigator we discussed earlier who came up with that gang vengeance theory is quoted pointing out something that actually makes a lot of sense, which is that the Good Samaritan may have made up a lame excuse to take Rosie home so that he could learn which apartment she lived in so that he'd know where to find her later. Think about it. There were other children and possibly parents at the playground. Abducting Rosie in front of them would have been risky, but finding out where she lived under the guise of helpfulness and returning later under the cover of night, well, he'd be a lot more likely to get away with that. At this point, maybe you're wondering, does the Good Samaritan look anything like the guy the neighbor had seen walking away from the canal with wet pants?
Did he have a beard is my first question.
No, neither of them had a beard. Not Wet Pants Guy and not Good Samaritan.
Okay, I can pass on him having a beard. I mean, 4-year-old at night,
in the dark, tired. Yeah.
Traumatic circumstance.
Yeah. So the answer as to whether these two men, the Good Samaritan and Wet Pants Guy, look alike is sort of, in my opinion. But also, the sketch of the Good Samaritan isn't super detailed, and he's also depicted wearing a hat and sunglasses, so we can't see his hair or eyes at all. The sketch of Wet Pants Guy, on the other hand, is quite good and quite detailed. So, Scott, here are the sketches of the Good Samaritan and the Wet Pants Guy, respectively. Good Samaritan is the one in the hat and sunglasses. What do you think?
All right, let's see here. Hat and sunglasses guy looks like an extraterrestrial.
I thought you were going to say he looks like Dale Gribble, because he kind of does.
Not Dale Gribble. Obviously Rusty Shackelford.
Either way.
And yeah, there is a drastic difference in detail and rendering. Kind of similar head outlines. I can see that. Ear placement seems to be about right. Like, all the major features seem to be pretty on, just for their location and in reference to other markers' locations.
Right, like the general shape. Now, we can't tell you whether the Good Samaritan has high cheekbones because there are no cheekbones. The drawing isn't detailed enough.
No, but there is potential for high cheekbones.
Yeah, just based off of the face shape.
It doesn't negate the high cheekbones.
Right.
And it doesn't also really show how high up on the head the eyes are because of obviously the sunglasses. But I mean, the mouth's pretty similar. Ears are a little bit different, but in the same location. Obviously, you can't see if there's a crease in the forehead or anything, but the teenager, not the Good Samaritan, he looks much older than 16 to me.
Yeah, I think he does in the sketch as well. So we've got both of these sketches up on our website for anyone who'd like to see for themselves. But to sum it up, both of the men are drawn with ovular faces and long, narrowish jaws. They also both appear to have slender builds. Beyond that, I'm not sure there are any discernible similarities. And, as you already brought up, Scott, as anyone who looks at the sketches will also notice, neither of the men have beards like that man Rosie's little brother reportedly saw in their bedroom that night did. But, of course, he was only 4 years old at the time, and he was sleepy, so the accuracy of this recollection of that night can't really be known. In any case, the Good Samaritan, whoever he really is perhaps the most suspicious individual associated with this case. So naturally, investigators were determined to figure out who he was, and as they canvassed the apartment complex, they spoke to residents who readily assisted. With their help, investigators quickly identified a lead on the Good Samaritan. Residents of the complex told investigators that there was a man who spent a lot of time at the complex's playground playing a guitar to entertain the children who congregated there. In the wake of Rosie's murder, many of the residents, including Rosie's family, found this suspicious. It's easy to see why they found this suspicious. A grown man hanging around a playground ingratiating himself to children? In a situation like this, that's something that needs to be investigated. However, when investigators followed up on this lead, they found that Guitar Man actually had a young son of his own who liked to spend time at the playground, so suddenly his frequent presence wasn't so odd after all. Additionally, according to an article by Michaela Robinson for the Deseret News, investigators determined that Guitar Man had been on an out-of-town trip at the time of Rosie's death, so that lead, as promising as it had originally seemed, fizzled out. The Good Samaritan remains unidentified to this day, which is frustrating because there's a real possibility that he was Rosie's killer. In the years since her death, investigators have fielded tips on the possible identity of the Good Samaritan. One of those tips came in 2018 when a man who'd previously lived in the apartment complex reported that the sketch of the Good Samaritan resembled a young man he'd known around the time of Rosie's death. According to that article for the Deseret News, the tipster stated that the young man in question had been known to hang out at the apartment complex back in 1995, when Rosie's life had been taken. Specifically, the man had hung out at the tipster's apartment, which overlooked the play area, because they were friends. Upon seeing the sketch, he wondered, could his old acquaintance have been responsible for what had happened to Rosie? Investigators wondered too, and investigated the lead. So far, the results of that lead, if any, remain unknown to the public. Not long after this tip, in January of 2019, another potential lead arose. Rosie's birthday was in January, and her mom, Luanne, went to visit her grave, burdened by the knowledge that if her daughter hadn't been murdered, she would have been 30 years old. And yet, despite the passage of nearly 25 years, justice had not been served. When Luane reached Rosie's grave, she saw that someone had left something there, a Barbie doll.
A Barbie doll?
Yeah, and sure, sometimes people place toys or sentimental items on the graves of lost loved ones, stuffed animals, for example, but it had been decades since Rosie's death, and no one in the Tapia family had left the doll. So who had placed it there anonymously after all this time? According to an article on K4.com, the Barbie had been manufactured in 1994, the year before Rosie's death. So it was a quarter of a century old by the time it was left at her gravesite. Pretty old in Barbie doll years, if those are a thing, and it was the type of Barbie that a little girl like Rosie might have played with back in the 90s. The specific model of Barbie was called a sweetheart. I looked up that specific doll and found that it came dressed in a cute, heart-printed outfit that presumably was its namesake. Of course, a sweetheart doll from the era of a deceased victim's childhood could just be an unusually thoughtful memorial gift. Or, potentially, its specificity and the fact that it was left at the gravesite, apparently not by a family member, nearly 25 years after the victim's death, could make it kind of creepy. And as far as I can tell, the general consensus on this doll being left at Rosie's gravesite is that it was indeed a creepy move.
Yes, it's creepy. Going back to the thoughtful thing, it could have been somebody that had learned of the case, given the recent updates or any of the recent information that was new to the area that happened to have a little girl from that era.
Yeah, maybe, but they really should have come forward if that was the case.
Yeah, that's not the kind of thing you stay anonymous about.
Yeah, now, if they had left it there for the reason you just described, obviously they were following the news around Rosie's death. So when investigators came on the news saying, hey, please come forward if you left this here, they presumably would have seen that. And presumably they did not come forward. But according to that K4.com article, the Utah Cold Case Coalition says that there were some additional factors regarding the doll that led them to believe it may be a valuable clue. Now, a quick note about the Utah Cold Case Coalition here. It's a nonprofit, all-volunteer organization that exists to bring public awareness to cold cases in the state of Utah. They maintain tip lines for cases and help raise reward funds. Back in 2018, they even championed a bill that requires the state of Utah to, quote, develop a secure database within the Utah Criminal Justice Information System that contains information related to each cold case that is open in any jurisdiction in the state, end quote.
That's really cool law, and
yeah,
I'm glad
cool.
They have it.
Yeah, they actually originally started specifically to bring awareness to Rosie's case, but they've since expanded and now help other families as well.
What a great story and a force for good. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, pretty cool. But so to be clear, when I say the Utah Cold Case Coalition said the doll may be a valuable clue, this is the organization I'm talking about, not cold case detectives from the Salt Lake City Police Department.
Yeah, they're not tied to law enforcement per se.
No, the Cold Case Coalition aren't law enforcement professionals themselves, but they certainly are a group of dedicated people who know Rosie's case and care very much about closure being brought to her family. Now, what those additional factors are that cause them to believe the Barbie doll is a clue, I can't say. Presumably, they haven't shared that information with the public for good reason. However, I can tell you that they funded cutting-edge touch DNA analysis for the doll, which was very expensive. They rely on donations, too, so paying for something like this was a big deal. They were willing to make the financial sacrifice, though, because they believe there are two individuals who they consider possible persons of interest in Rosie's case who have some sort of fixation with Barbie dolls.
Go on.
Well, I wish I could tell you what the results of the DNA extraction and analysis were. Like, were they able to successfully extract and identify a DNA profile from the doll? And if so, do we know who the profile belongs to and whether or not they have a criminal record? However, I haven't been able to find any news sources with a public update on the matter. Before we move on, a quick side note here about the statewide cold case database we mentioned a few moments ago. I have no doubt that the database will be helpful to Utah investigators, especially since the bill also required the hiring of a full-time analyst whose job it is to review all of the cases in the database and look for possible connections. But statewide databases are just one piece of the investigative puzzle. It's really important that cases like Rosie's be entered into a national unsolved case database. And I'm talking, of course, about my beloved VICAP.
You do love VICAP.
VICAP, as anyone who listens regularly to this show may already know, is a nationwide unsolved case database maintained by the FBI. It's a tremendously important and helpful tool which allows investigators and analysts like myself to compare homicide, missing persons, and sexual assault cases from all across the United States to similar cases in our own jurisdictions, which is necessary because many serial offenders commit crimes in multiple states. The FBI also employs multiple analysts of its own who actively look for connections between the cases in the database. Here's the thing about VICAP, though. Police departments aren't legally required to enter cases into it. It's something that's available to detectives and crime analysts like myself, but there's no law demanding that we use it. And not all departments use it, unfortunately.
And within the departments, not a lot of officers even know how to use it.
Or necessarily that it even exists. So, if you ever find yourself in the unfortunate position of having to advocate for a loved one's unsolved homicide, and I hope you never do, make sure you speak to the investigator about VICAP and insist that the case be entered into it if it meets the criteria for inclusion.
If they need help, there are tons of resources out there to help them figure out the process.
Literally anyone can just ask the FBI to train them on how to do it. It's just something they offer. It costs nothing. It just takes a few hours of time. So, when it comes to Rosie's case, over the years, investigators have questioned some potential suspects. One such individual was Terry Lee Black, a man who is a convicted child murderer and also bank robber, for the record. Black was arrested in 2012 after stealing a vehicle and robbing a bank in West Jordan, Utah. At the time, the town was on edge because one of their own, a 6-year-old girl named Sierra Newbold, had recently been abducted from her home, sexually assaulted, and murdered. Soon after Black's arrest for the bank robbery, police realized that he was responsible for something far worse, Sierra's murder. He was actually still wearing the clothing he'd had on when he'd committed that murder, and it was covered in evidence. Black was charged with abducting, sexually assaulting, and murdering Sierra. He was convicted, and today he's exactly where he belongs, in prison. In the wake of what happened to Sierra, though, investigators couldn't help but notice her case bore a lot of similarities to Rosie's. For starters, the girls, 5 and 6 years old respectively, were approximately the same age, and both of them had been abducted from their homes in the dead of night. Rosie's abductor had of course entered through a window, and Black had entered Sierra's home through a sliding glass door. Both girls were sexually assaulted and murdered afterward in the same way, by drowning in a nearby canal.
That's
such an unusual way to kill someone, right? It really stands out.
It really does.
Yeah, it's weird.
It's not the most effective, it's not the most efficient, and it's a very intensive and physical way of killing somebody.
Naturally, with such tremendous possibilities present between the two cases, investigators questioned Black about possible involvement in Rosie's case. What came of those questions, if anything, I don't know. I can tell you, though, that Black was a neighbor of Sierra's and was even known to attend the same church as she and her family, so he likely was aware of her existence and may have premeditated her abduction and murder. Where exactly Black was living back in 1995 when Rosie was abducted and killed, I don't know. To date, Black has not been charged with any crime in relation to Rosie's death. Whether or not investigators consider him a person of interest or potential suspect at this point is unknown to the public. However, I personally suspect that investigators may have determined that he wasn't involved. And I say this because some of the news sources I read while researching this case imply that investigators have DNA evidence from the crime scene, possibly collected from Rosie's body, although I don't know for sure. This DNA evidence isn't mentioned very often, though, for some reason, so I can't say with 100% confidence that it exists, but it seems so. And obviously, investigators could compare a potential suspect's DNA with any DNA from the crime scene, which brings me to a recent interesting development in Rosie's case. You know those potential suspect sketches we looked at earlier?
I do.
Well, the more detailed sketch, not the one with the hat and glasses, the wet pants guy one, wasn't actually created until 2019. And when it was finished and revealed to the public, it was of course a newsworthy deal. Lots of people saw it, including a man named Danny. Danny, who's now middle-aged, was interested in the case because not long before the time of Rosie's death, he'd been a boyfriend of Rosie's older sister, Amelia. So he was there and knew what was going on when this whole tragedy unfolded. And he and Amelia, teenagers at the time, while seeing each other, had sometimes been sneaky with their rendezvous. Specifically, Danny had sometimes snuck into the Tapia family's apartment to visit Amelia at night when her parents were asleep. Guess how he snuck into the house?
Through a ground floor window.
Yeah, specifically through the window in Rosie and the twins' bedroom, the same one Rosie's abductor had entered through. Now, at the time, that bedroom had actually been Amelia's, not Rosie and the twins. So that was why he had used that window to enter. He wasn't like sneaking through the kids' bedroom to get into another part of the house. It was just Amelia's bedroom at the time.
That was my next question.
Yeah. But the point is, Danny knew it was possible to enter the residence through that window without being caught, and he wasn't the only one who knew that. When he saw the sketch, he thought it looked a lot like an old friend of his, a friend who he'd hung out with frequently back in 1995. And he says that that friend knew he'd used that window to get into the bedroom because he'd seen him do it before. So when the sketch came out, Danny texted that old friend, who hasn't been publicly identified, and told him, hey, that sketch looks a lot like you. And this contact wasn't out of the blue, to be clear. Danny still kept in some touch with his old friend. And actually, that old friend had called him just 2 months before. He'd called Danny because it had been announced on the news that the sketch had been made. The news only showed small parts of the sketch, though, because the police hadn't approved of the sketch being totally released to the public yet. So it was kind of just like a teaser to garner public interest. And so the news media waited about 2 months until police finally gave them the okay. And then they released the entire sketch to the viewing public. But 2 months beforehand, when the news had basically done that teaser and said that the sketch had been made, that unidentified friend had called Danny about it, and they'd talked about it, and he'd said, wouldn't it be funny if it looked like one of us?
That's a pretty strange comment.
Yeah, because of the whole window thing. He knew that the killer had entered through that window, and he knew that he and Danny and maybe some of their other friend group knew about the window being a thing, and he was like, hey, wouldn't it be funny if it looked like one of us? Now, 2 months later, Danny saw the sketch and realized that sure enough, it did look like one of them. It looked like the unidentified friend. Now, even though the unidentified friend had said that it would be funny if it looked like one of them, he wasn't actually all that amused when the sketch came out and did resemble him. In fact, he told Danny that he didn't think it looked like him. He thought it looked more like Danny. Apparently, though, police didn't think so, because when police found out about the resemblance, they didn't want Danny's DNA, although he offered to give it to them. They wanted the unidentified friends. The friend wasn't thrilled, but Danny told him, look, if you're innocent, you shouldn't be worried about it. So police spoke to him and collected a sample of his DNA. That was back in 2020, and nothing I could find has been published about it since. So whether or not police still consider the unidentified friend a potential suspect, I don't know. All I can say with certainty is that so far, he hasn't been charged with any crimes in relation to Rosie's death. I do feel it's important to mention, though, that the sketch was made based off of the 20-plus-year-old recollections of a single witness. If that witness truly and clearly recalled the face of the man he saw walking away from the canal in partially soaked pants more than 20 years later, that's very impressive. But it's difficult for me to imagine that the memory was likely to be crystal clear after so long. In any case, as time marches on, the identity of Rosie's killer remains a mystery. Justice has yet to be served, and her family is still awaiting closure more than 20 years after she was taken from them. If you have any information regarding the abduction and murder of Rosie Tapia, please call the Salt Lake City Police at 801-799-3000. Or if you prefer to give a tip anonymously, you can text keyword TIPSLCPD to 274-637. Or submit your tip anonymously online by visiting TIPSubmit.com.
That's all for this episode of Last Seen Alive. We hope you've enjoyed listening. Make sure you check out our website, lastseenalivepodcast.com, for photos from the story and links to the sources we used to write it. While you're at it, follow us on Insta and Twitter at LSA Podcast. New episodes of Last Seen Alive go live every other Monday. See you then. And if you think bringing unsolved cases like Rosie's to the public's attention is important, please take a moment to rate or review Last Seen Alive and tell your friends to check us out too. We really would appreciate it. Last Seen Alive is written and researched by you, Leah. Audio engineering and editing is provided by me, Scott, along with our podcast production partners, Podcast Post Production. Check them out at podcastpostproduction.com for all of your podcasting needs.